Hello, this is Kim Anderson, and this is another talk about birth rates. I've kind of been going in order of the most common assumptions, the most common topics that come up in the overpopulation discussions. And one of the other biggest topics and biggest reasons behind why we are overpopulated, why the birth rates are so high, even though a lot of people don't think they're very high, they are high enough that they've allowed the population to skyrocket for quite a long time. And it comes down to religion, where religion has been mentioned a lot. And when I broke that down, I'd seen some articles about the subject. And when I looked at it and I looked at the data, it did agree exactly with what they were saying. Okay, so here's an article from Pew Research in the US, and this is a breakdown of the population of the major world religions here. And you can see from the title, Islam was the world's fastest growing religion from 2010 to 2020. And this came out in June of 2025. Conrad Hackett is where this is from. And you can see clearly down here that it's true the Muslim population increased by 20.7%. And most of the groups increased quite a bit except for Buddhists. But what's really interesting also is although the increase in population for Islam was so high, the next highest growth of different groups was religious unaffiliated, went from 1.6 billion to 1.9 billion. So that was the second largest increase of all these different groups. And then we've got Hindus and other religions also that were fairly high in their growth rate. And you can see Christianity didn't grow as much, only 5.7%, but they're already at 2.3 billion, so they're still the highest. Although you can imagine if this growth rate continues, then probably Islam will become the number one largest group. But the unaffiliated, even though they have an even lower birth rate than the Buddhist group, I think a big reason why this group has increased is probably just from people deconverting and actually leaving religion. So let's hope that this number continues to increase, and hopefully the rest of these will decrease or at least remain stable, so it can bring these overall numbers down to a sustainable population. It is absolutely true that religion is a huge factor in why people have children. And I think it's really concerning. I have to be totally open about my bias here. I am agnostic. I have a lot of respect for indigenous spirituality and cultures. I have studied Buddhism quite a bit. I did a lot of meditation, and I was raised Roman Catholic, right? So very, very pronatalist religion. And, I saw that there was a lot of trauma in my family because of religion and because of pronatalism. And I realized that what it had led to was very irresponsible behavior. And I find it very strange that people consider religion to be a source of morality when in fact it's kind of the opposite, and it depends on what religion you're talking about. And they are all a little bit different. And I think that they all have certain ideas that may have more merit than others. As far as my own bias goes, I have to say, I was quite surprised and quite taken aback when I saw the results that I put together. So I basically went through all the countries in the United Nations list to find the dominant religion. And so I tried to find the religion that was, for the most part, they were over 80%. And wow, the results were really, really shocking because my personal opinion of those religions was pretty much inversely related to the actual birth rates of those religions. And that's really scary. So this chart is pretty straightforward. I went through all of the countries of the world and looked at what the majority of the population was classified as when it came to religion. And this is sort of what I've come up with. And then I went through each of those and averaged the birth rate in each of those populations. Now, the bottom two are kind of difficult to categorize. Often unaffiliated and folk go together. And not only that, but also Buddhism. So it's no coincidence that Buddhism, unaffiliated, and folk religions are all kind of in the bottom of these birth rates. And then we have Hinduism right in the middle. And then at the top, birth rates here, we've got the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And this was something that I've seen talked about before. I knew that the Islamic countries have the highest birth rates, and that seems to be shown here pretty directly. What that's showing me is that, perhaps my focus on overpopulation and the fact that I can even acknowledge it shows that I have a strong belief system based in reason, intelligence, truth, provability, science, and compassion, and a lot of the religions don't have that. When we talk about faith, you're already looking at an objection to truth, because the whole goal of faith is to believe in something regardless of whether it's provable or not. In fact, they often show that the test of faith is if you believe in it, even if there seems to be evidence against it, which really pushes people to behave in ways that don't really follow along with reality. I think it's dangerous to have too much faith that your beliefs are more important than other people's reality. I think you have to, give some credibility to other people having existence and having reality and having feelings that are important, just as important as your feelings are to you. So when we look at these different religions, and I'll go over what the major religions are. So as I said, I looked through all the countries and found the majority religion. So the major religions of the world are Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and then outside of that, those are the major organized religions. Outside of those, the only other religions represented were basically no religion, unaffiliated, which could comprise quite a broad group of ideologies. Agnosticism, atheism, those could be considered in unaffiliated, non-religious. And the other group is indigenous or folk religions. And those are also very significant. And that could comprise, like, the major ones would be Shinto in Japan, Voodoo, which is in Africa and parts of the Caribbean, and Native American spirituality. Also, Confucianism is included as a folk religion. Okay, so just to give a good sense of just how many people are in each of these religions. Now, again, I'm using the majority country numbers as opposed to the actual adherents of each religion. So all of this population would add up to the total global population. So I'm including countries of the majority in these numbers. So Christianity has the highest population up here, which I believe is over 2 billion. And then we've got Muslim countries coming in second here. And then we've got unaffiliated here. We've got Hindu here. And then Buddhist countries down here. Folk religion down here. And then the one country of Israel, the Jewish country here. So that gives you a sense of what the world's countries' populations are when divided by religion. And I'm just going to take this one out so we can see Now, this is the number of countries, right? So at the top here, we've got over 160. Again, this is from the United Nations. They're not necessarily politically independent countries. They're basically geographically independent countries. So Christianity by far at the top, over 160. Then we've got Muslim at 51, I've got here on my list. Unaffiliated, we've got 6 countries. Hindu, 3 countries. Buddhist, 8 countries. Folk, we've got 2 countries. And then the Jewish has 1 country of Israel. So just to get a sense of how many people and how many countries there are in each of these groups. Buddhism and then Hinduism, those 2 are considered to be dharmic religions. And then we have the Abrahamic religions, which is Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Now here's a breakdown of the groups even more. These are the Abrahamic religions here. These are the dharmic religions, which is Hinduism and Buddhism here. And this is unaffiliated and folk religions at the bottom. So a pretty clear correlation with this sort of monotheistic patriarchal religion here. These religions are also patriarchal, but less theistic. And of course here, which is pretty much a very diverse group of everyone else who is not a part of these religions. So on the high birth rate end, we've got Islam followed by Judaism and then Christianity. So those 3 have the highest birth rates of any other religious group in the world. And that's not surprising because guess what it says in the Abrahamic Bible is go forth and multiply. So there's this idea of a commandment from God to have as many children as possible. And that's led to all kinds of violence, war, diseases, and so on. They also practice things like domestic abuse and inbreeding and the objectification and the slavery of women and slavery in general. All 3 of them have a very, very dark history if you really look into it. And they're all very, very patriarchal. So there's a pretty obvious connection between the direct teachings in these religions and the fact that their birth rates are so high. The colonization projects of Europeans spread Christianity all over the world. So there's a long list of little tiny islands all through the Caribbean and all through Polynesia, which are virtually all been Christianized. So that's why that list is so long of Christian countries. Also, Africa is almost half and half Islam and Christianity, with little pockets of unaffiliated or folk religion. But for the most part, they have become very strongly Muslim and Christian. Now, when I looked at those religions in more detail, actually the highest birth rates of all the countries, when you looked at the secondary religion as well, was Christian and Muslim. So Christian countries with a secondary population of over 10% Muslim had the highest birth rates of any other in the world, which is kind of interesting. And I think what that made me think of too is the idea of birth war. And a birth war is essentially that when you see other groups of people around you having 5, 6, 7, 8 children, having a lot of children, it makes you feel threatened. It makes you feel like perhaps there will be a genocide. And I think this is something that's kind of instinctive. For some people, they may be cognitively aware of it. If you perceive that you're being outnumbered by people of a different group around you, that can often turn into a motivation to have more children. And Christianity and Islam are very, very similar in that they rely very strongly on conversion. So both of those religions have passively and often very violently and actively converted people into their religion. Often people will do it willingly, but oftentimes it's not willingly. And there's a whole process of cult manipulation. And if you get into cults, then you'll understand a little more of the dynamics of that, and something like Stockholm Syndrome, where people can actually be kidnapped and will convert just in order to stay alive. And so they'll become brainwashed into the mentality of their captor in order to keep going. that they believe that someone that powerful, that has power over them, must be right. So therefore they follow this very, very often very violent religions in order to go along with it. So Islam and Christianity are just dominating the world basically, with high numbers of children and often very theocratic regimes. Many of the countries that are now majority Muslim will often kick people out who aren't Muslim. Christians have done the same thing. I mean, it's virtually identical patterns, that they have followed. If you want to dig into the history, the European colonization, of course, was connected to Christianity, and Arab colonization was connected to Islam. And I'll show you the map of where all the religions are, and you can see that Christianity and Islam just completely dominate the majority of the world's landmass when you come to how many countries are in the majority. Here we have the religion of majority. All of the religions that I've been using for this talk are very recent. This is from 2021. Of course, with time, a lot of the religion changes. A lot of them get converted or deconverted to various other religions. But this gives a good sense of the overall majority of where the religions are. The majority of the world is governed by countries that are dominated by Christianity in blue or Islam in green. Purple, unaffiliated, which is a lot of East Asia, which is also overlapping with Buddhism here in orange, Hinduism in yellow, and the one country of Israel. In this particular map, political boundaries here that you see are from this map and the input, which most of the world follows kind of what the United Nations does. Now, part of the reason why the Christian birth rates are a little bit lower, I mean, you could argue that it could be partly because there is also some traditions of not getting married and not having children. In Catholicism, priests are not expected to get married. They have things like nuns and monks, which is also a parallel to Buddhism, interestingly enough. And the Buddhist birth rate is even lower, right? Hinduism and Buddhism, at least in the countries of their majority, have lower birth rates than the Christian majority. However, Christianity also has a very, very large number of those countries that have significant, as in over 10% of their population are unaffiliated. So there's a much bigger rise in non-religious mentality in the Christian world. Now, Judaism, of course, there's only one example of Israel, but that's also an interesting case where although the majority of the population affiliates as a Jew, doesn't necessarily mean that they follow the Jewish religion. So there is still secularism and non-religion, even though they may associate themselves with being Jewish, and that just comes from the complication of a mix of ethnicity, culture, and religion. It's not just one. It's not just religion. Whereas Christianity and Islam are fundamentally just religious. They are based on belief. They're not cultures. They're not based in culture. They are imperial tools of colonization, essentially. And Hinduism and Buddhism are also kind of similar. And I think what's interesting about them is Hinduism does bring a lot of the previous indigenous culture into its religion. However, it's still the story of patriarchy. It's still the story of colonization. It's still very violent. It's still very hierarchical. And there's still a lot of those same colonial patriarchal ideas in Hinduism that cause a lot of problems. And Buddhism too, and Buddhism is interesting because it's known for being a very peaceful religion, and interesting that, of the organized religions, their birth rate is the lowest. And also, they have this strong system of monasteries and convents, like I said, like nuns and monks, so who don't have children or not supposed to have children, and they live at a very ascetic lifestyle. So it's interesting when you look at that. And the most important thing I want to say about that with Buddhism, and that goes back to what I was talking about with unaffiliated And folk religions is actually the majority of East Asia, right? So China, the Koreas, Japan are a combination of all three of those. So even categorizing a country as one or the other is a bit of a complicated decision. And that's the thing about Buddhism that blends itself into other religions and why it has been less domineering compared to Islam and Christianity, is because it's not basing itself purely on the idea that you must be Buddhist. Like, you can practice Buddhism. I mean, I went to a Buddhist meditation camp. There was no pressure to become a Buddhist. But if you go to a Christian camp, you can be sure that you will be pressured to become Christian, and they will tell you that you're going to hell if you don't do it. So it's a very, very different kind of thing. You know, Buddhism is about practicing meditation, and the other philosophies behind it don't really matter. And again, there's no God in it. It's an atheist religion. So it's more of a practice than it is an organized religion in the sense that you need to join. You don't need to join. You can practice Buddhist meditation and not be a part of it. And that's why it blends in with folk religions and with unaffiliated. Again, atheists and Buddhists, you can be all three of those things. And a lot of East Asia is all three of those things. And then when you get into Hinduism, so again, Buddhism and Hinduism, part of the Dharmic religions, Hinduism is a pantheon, right? So there's many different gods and goddesses that you can worship or align yourself with within that religion. So already it's a mix of a bunch of different things. And because of that, it keeps it more open. And then I think it really becomes the human ego and this sense of tribalism that pulls people into turning it into an us versus them type of situation, but it doesn't have to be. You know, so that's what's so scary, is that basically at the lowest birth rate end, you have the most open groups, which is unaffiliated. You can believe whatever the heck you want. You don't have to be part of anything. Folk religions, which are more about culture and practicing a specific culture and tradition, or philosophies, right? These are all open. You can dabble in whatever you want, and that's how I am. You know, I don't believe in belonging to an organized religion. I don't believe in conversion. I think that those are bad ideas. And seeing all these different birth rates has just convinced me even more that I'm right, and that these religions are in fact very, very dangerous, because they're brainwashing children into believing that they're better than everyone else because of their belief system. And I think that's just a whole lot of crazy, and that's going to lead us to war. And I think that's exactly what has led us to war. And so then as you get up that, so Buddhism and Hinduism get a little more organized, a little more patriarchal, you know, and you can still have patriarchy in the unaffiliated and folk religions. It's not that those things are going to make you immune to that, but they don't focus on those things. It's a choice, because you can believe whatever you want. You can believe in that or you cannot believe in that. It's kind of up to you. It's not within the religion. It's like signing up for a political party. So the harsher the rules, the more segregationists there are, the higher the birth rate tends to be. And I think that that comes from the sense of obligation. The Abrahamic religions set out these very, very particular rules that are mostly random. They're mostly made up by some guy who's dead. You know, there is so much of this is based on dead men. And I just think it's very dangerous. Like, I think that that should really, really concern us. And unfortunately for the pronatalists that aren't religious, they tend to like talk up the religions as though it's a good thing that they're having so many children. But I really think it's a bad thing. And I think it's that also what it leads to is a lot of abandoned children, a lot of abused children, a lot of miserable people, to be honest. Like, those religions are not known for joy or happiness. They're known for like being very strict and also inbreeding, right? So they're basically bringing us towards de-evolution. And I think that that's a bad direction to go in. So I think the most hopeful that I am about it is the fact that unaffiliated is growing. So even though you have these very high birth rates in the Abrahamic religions, the fact is a lot of what's feeding the unaffiliated side is exactly those people who are deconstructing Christianity, deconstructing Mormonism, deconstructing Islam, and realizing, hey, these religions make absolutely no sense. And they're pushing us to do things that go against what we actually want, and they're going against what's good for them. So that's kind of where my hope is. You know, unfortunately, right now, there's only one Muslim country that also has a a unaffiliated population over 10%, which is Albania. That doesn't mean that's necessarily fact. I'm looking this up from statistics, of course. They're not always going to represent pure reality. And you'll find that too, even if you try to look up the religion of Japan. It's like, depends on what question you ask. We have this assumption for those who were raised in Abrahamic religion that your religion is your religion, and that's a categorizable thing. I've even heard, and I don't know if this is true or not, but they were saying that in the next census that they were going to ask people what their religion was, even if they don't practice anymore. And there was a lot of objection to that, and I strongly object to that wording as well, because religions are belief systems, and so you should never associate yourself with a belief system that you don't actually believe in. I think that's very wrong. And I disassociated myself from the Roman Catholic Church when I was supposed to get confirmed, because I did not believe what I was told, what I was supposed to say that I believed in. I did not believe in it. So I became an apostate at that point, which is when you are an unbeliever. And I think that comes down to my own philosophy. And I don't want to get too much into my philosophy, because it's not what this is about. This is about the birth rates. And I'm just going to really focus on these different statistics and show you the graphs, show you the charts, just to get into a little more detail. So this chart I have made from a study that came out in 2018 from Pew Research. And this was a religious survey. The original study was actually about the age gap in religion, but they had a whole bunch of data that I ended up using for my own research here. So what this shows is different questions that were asked in this survey. This one is what your religious affiliation is, if you have an affiliation. And this is 100% right here. This is the percentages. This question was, is religion very important to you? This question was, do you attend a weekly religious service? And this question was, do you pray daily? So I'm going to look at these answers in another chart as well. But the division here that I have made is coming back to the crude birth rate. Now, this is the lowest crude birth rate from 0 to 1.5. This is 1.5 to 2.5. And this one is 2.5 to 3.5. And then finally 3.5 to 4.6. So these divisions basically dividing all of the different countries that they went through and looked at how it's related to the birth rate. And so you can see very clearly that most of these are pretty directly correlated. And of course, if you get into smaller divisions, it's not quite as straightforward. I've divided all of these countries into only 4 groups. But this is how you see it very clearly. And this is the only one, which is religious affiliation, that shows a slight decrease at the top level. Now, the reason why affiliation might be different than these other questions is affiliation is just as kind of asking, what are you? Like, are you Hindu, Jewish, etc.? And sometimes people affiliate themselves with a religion because they connected to culture, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they practice the religion. So this question, is religion very important to you? This has to do with what you actually think about the religion. And you can see at the top birth rate levels, it's very high. So, and at the bottom, of course, it's also very low. And for this one, these two have more to do with actual behavior. If you attend a weekly service, this is pretty much directly correlated. And this one is if you pray daily. And again, this has got a pretty strong correlation with that crude birth rate as well. So only this affiliation doesn't quite match up as much as the others. And again, it's because affiliation doesn't necessarily always relate directly to behavior. So that's kind of showing that religious behavior often also includes having children. So often if people are practicing their religion, they also may be including having children if that's what their religion dictates. So this is taken from the same religious survey from 2018 from Pew. And I just wanted to go over some of the breakdown by religion. I showed the connection between the birth rate and these different factors of religion, which was affiliation, importance, weekly religious attendance, and daily prayer. And I just wanted to make a little comparison now. The number of countries in this study from Pew was 107. And generally, when you look at the United Nations and how many different countries they list, it's over 200. So this isn't a snapshot of the entire world, but it is still 107 countries, which is quite a few. And as you can see, that this one statistic is missing here, which is there was only one Hindu country in this survey, which was India. And this was just not a thing apparently in Hinduism to have weekly religious events anyway. So that wasn't included in that particular statistic. And as you can see, there's also no Buddhist countries that were included in that as well. So we've got unaffiliated folk in this one category. We've got the Jewish country of Israel, we've got Christian countries, and we've got Muslim countries. So affiliation, unsurprisingly, we're seeing a very low level of affiliation in a group that is literally labeled unaffiliated. So it's pretty much defined by their lack of affiliation to a specific religion, which is why it's so low in these countries. And here we've got the one country of India, which is all the way to 100%. So according to this survey, every single person from India that they asked the question had some religious affiliation. And the majority of that would be Hindu, and also the secondary religion in that country would be Islam. And as you can see, Islam also has the second highest level of affiliation, over 99%, followed by Israel. And of course, that's very notable because, Judaism and the Jewish culture kind of blur the line between ethnicity, religion, and culture. And obviously, Israel is dominated by Judaism and also the secondary religion of Islam as well. And the Christian countries are mostly all over the place. A lot of them do have a significant over 10% level of unaffiliated. And you can see that pretty clearly right here. It's 86%. So a lot of the unaffiliated are also in Christian countries. Now we've got the level of importance, and this is also very different. So you can see that in India, there's still a very strong level of importance. So this is more of a subjective question when you're asking people how important their religion is. So yeah, very interesting that the Hindu country was the highest, followed by Muslim countries, 71%, then Christian, then Judaism, and then unaffiliated at the bottom. This is unsurprising, obviously, but it's also very interesting, the difference between Judaism here and here. So even though most of Israel associates itself or affiliates itself with the religion, it doesn't mean that they consider the religion to be very important. Now we can see this is a weekly attendance. So this is measuring the actual behavior of people. Muslim countries definitely have the highest, followed by Christian, Jewish, and finally unaffiliated at the bottom. And as we mentioned, Hinduism is not there. Daily prayer, actually, again, we've got India at the highest. So the most of the population, 75%, say that they pray every day. And that's followed by Islam, by the Muslim countries. And it's interesting that this was actually fairly low. This is about 2/3, 66% of the people in Muslim countries. There are some Muslim sects that actually pray 5 times a day. So it's interesting that that number was actually lower than I would have expected it to be. And then we've got Christian countries praying every day, Jewish, and then finally unaffiliated at the bottom. And I wanted to include the birth rates here just because they were a little bit different, because again, this is a list of 107 countries and not all of the countries of the world. And in this particular breakdown, we can see that actually when we compare just India with this particular list of Christian countries, that Hinduism comes up higher in the birth rate. So 1.7 versus the average in Christian countries of 1.6. I just want to go over what those general correlations are with religion, not just birth rates, but other things like, gender, which is always a really big deal with religion. So here we have a breakdown of some different gendered issues. We've got education right here, some secondary education. We've got labor force right here, and these are the seats in parliament. So these are seats in parliament held by women, and as of a percentage. So we've got 20 here, there's 100 up here. So pretty low overall. I mean, none of these groups are showing an average over 30%. Christian countries are at the top. So the highest number of women in power found in Christian countries, followed by Israel, followed by Hindu countries. Then we've got unaffiliated, and finally Muslim and Buddhist countries at the bottom. And here we've got females with at least some secondary education. Now I wanted to put the males on here as well, just so you can see the difference. Because obviously if you just compare these different groups to each other, it doesn't really give you an overall sense of what the gender difference is. So in all cases, they're pretty much following the same pattern. And in all cases, the male lines here, the averages are higher for secondary education than they are for women here. But you can see, obviously, Israel and the unaffiliated countries and folk countries are the highest for both men and women. Here we've got labor force. So this is female labor force. This is male labor force. And this is a little bit different in this comparison. Males also overall is a lot higher than for all the female groups. But you can see it is different. So in Hindu countries, we've got men working the most, whereas they're second to the bottom when it comes to women. So that's a pretty big difference. And also a really, really huge difference between men and women in Muslim countries. And it's by far the lowest here in Muslim countries for female labor. So just gives you kind of an overall snapshot of kind of what's going on with different gender relationships when it comes to religion. So here we have some different measures of contraception and other policies and how much people use them. So this group of statistics doesn't include Israel. That's why it's not on here. We've got maternity and paternity leave. So you can see that unaffiliated folk, which is this purple line, is by far and away higher than the others, and followed by Christian when it comes to maternity leave. Islamic countries are pretty high there as well, and the lowest we've got Buddhist countries. Paternity leave, it's also highest in unaffiliated, and then Hindu is the next highest. And here we have total contraception, this one here. So obviously you would expect the lowest birth rates to be in line with the highest use of contraception, which is pretty much the case except for Christian countries, which have a higher level of total contraception use compared to what their birth rate would be. And this is the gender difference between contraception. So this is just how much more women use contraception than men. And there are some countries where it's the other way around, where actually some men use contraception more often than women overall. And that would be in unaffiliated and folk, which is the lowest. So when men use contraception, it tends to be more effective. And here you can see that it's mostly women using contraception in the Buddhist countries, and then Hindu, Christian, and Muslim. And finally, abortion access. So I just went through the different countries and rated them. So basically 10 is unrestricted, and 60 up here would be totally banned. And so I averaged the countries in each of these, so you can see actually that the most restrictions, surprisingly, for abortion are in Buddhist countries, and I'm not sure why that is. Definitely I'm seeing a lot of gender issues in Buddhist countries, followed by Muslim countries, then Christian, Hindu, and finally the least restrictions to abortion are in the unaffiliated or folk countries, which is kind of what you would expect. And also, you can't really look at religion without also looking at places and regions and the cultures of different regions. And of course, a lot of the origins of those religions were based in indigenous culture at one point in the past. And then they just kind of mutated and grew and changed into, like I said, something a lot more imperial in the end. And I hope that as we move towards more enlightened, belief systems and openness, I think we need to be very open about what kind of belief systems we get into. And again, I'm open about my bias. I'm saying it, and I don't want to get preaching too much right now, but I'm just going to keep going over all of those different religions and what they are associated with when we look at those statistics. Here we have some measures of quality of life and different religious groups. And these are all taken from the United Nations, which is where most of these statistics are coming from. And you can see here infant mortality and maternal mortality. So basically infants and mothers who die in childbirth. And we can see that the highest for both of those are in Muslim countries, and the lowest for both of those is in Israel, followed by unaffiliated. And they're actually pretty similar in the order. So Hindu countries come after Muslim countries, then Christian, then Buddhist, then unaffiliated, and finally Israel at the bottom. So that's the pretty big quality of life factor, especially when it comes to healthcare and also specifically women's healthcare. Here we have adolescent birth rate, looking at fairly similar order to this as well. 48.7 to 49.5. So the highest adolescent birth rate is in Muslim countries, followed by Christian countries. So these two you can see are definitely the highest. And finally, we've got Hindu, Buddhist coming in third and fourth there, and then unaffiliated and Jewish with the lowest adolescent birth rates. And here is life expectancy. So that's one of the biggest quality of life factors, obviously. Israel is coming in at the highest. So they have the highest life expectancy at birth, followed by unaffiliated, then Buddhist. And then we've got Christian, Hindu, and Muslim countries at the bottom. And here we have sex ratio for the general population. So this is males per 100 females. This line here is 100. So you can see that Muslim countries have a lot more men than women in their general population. And you can see this line. Every single other religious group has more females than males in their general population. So that's a pretty big, significant issue there. And there are some Muslim countries where it's as high as 3 men for every woman. So that's pretty significant. So you can see women's rights in general and life expectancy are pretty correlated. And Muslim countries in all of these categories are the lowest quality of life. So thanks so much for your time, and I hope that you will come back and maybe learn a little bit more about the birth rates. Feel free to ask questions if you want, if they're reasonable questions. I mean, it's kind of strange online because some people make very strange comments without actually watching the video. Otherwise, if you want to get through and ask some detailed questions or look at it differently, then I'm totally open to that, and that can help to inform future videos. So thanks for your time. This is Kim Anderson.